am extremely pleased to introduce to you our speaker, James Longabaugh, who is our Director of Consulting at WSA. James brings over 15 years of experience in talent acquisition, employee engagement, customer surveys, talent assessment, and workforce analytics, spanning a variety of organizations and industries. So please join me in welcoming James Longabaugh as he shares his expertise with us today.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris, for the warm introduction. Welcome, everybody. Um, have a really exciting session today that really follows up on all the really great research that Chris presented just last month, which follows on to a lot of our state of the workforce research that we've discovered over the last year. And so we're going to kind of dive into taking a look at a few different things, but also tagging on to a couple of areas that Chris presented on last month, such as following on to manager effectiveness trends, but also what are some of those top predictors of manager effectiveness today? She also kind of highlighted some trends as it relates to employees' intent to stay or commitment, but we're going to dive a little bit deeper there and also take a look at some generational differences that we've found to be really interesting and where organizations may want to be focusing some time and attention. Then also, what are some of those top predictors of whether employees stay or leave? And then we'll wrap up with some of the key takeaways and practical implications from our research as well. As we kind of jump into this, as you remember in part one of our State of the Workforce learning session last month, Chris highlighted the trends for both engagement as well as manager effectiveness. For this part of our session, though, we're really going to focus on just manager effectiveness specifically. Again, while engagement returned to pre-pandemic levels, manager effectiveness still kind of has continued to maintain at an all-time high through the end of 2024. Given some of the complexities of the last few years, we can kind of see that this relationship between employee and their direct manager has really had to deepen as managers became more of the lifeline for employees, particularly during that pandemic, which really strengthened that bond. Therefore, managers today are probably taking on a greater role regarding the employee experience than they ever have before. And not only did managers need to ensure employees of their safety, their security, they also had to create new operating structures for which employees had to adapt. And this shift in employee sentiment toward their managers is really kind of that reflection of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And this kind of resorts kind of more recently to higher order needs post-pandemic. And as we're going to kind of find out through our research, we've also found that manager effectiveness has become an even more top predictor of engagement than it had in the past, indicating this need for continued focus and investment in this particular pivotal employee group. We take a look at what are those important behaviors or actions on behalf of managers that lead to their direct reports rating them as an effective leader. We're really going to find that these behaviors are particularly powerful because they address some of those multiple levels of Maslow's hierarchy simultaneously. And this creates both psychological safety as well as opportunities for growth. When managers satisfy these fundamental human needs, we kind of see that employees can focus their energy, their performance, rather than self-protection or navigating some unclear expectations. One of the top predictors that we've found recently is around managers who treat their employees with respect. From this regard, we really see that this creates that psychological safety. This allows employees to contribute ideas without fear, particularly that their ideas might be different than others. This also satisfies that belonging need, or what we might see as Maslow's third level, by validating employees' inherent worth. And this also forms that foundation of trust, which enables all other managerial functions. One of the other top predictors is around managers communicating reasons for change. Well, we know this is important because the only constant today in any organization is change, particularly in this uncertain market, of course. And this addresses some of those safety needs, Maslow's second level, by reducing some of that uncertainty, that anxiety. And it also demonstrates transparency, which, as we know from research around what is indicative of trust, this really builds that trust during potentially some of these destabilizing periods that we have had the opportunity of experiencing over the last 5 years. And it also engages employees as partners rather than subordinates in organizational evolution. As we know, and all of us would agree, of course, that we would rather have things done with us than to us, of course. The third major predictor that we found is treating people fairly. Everyone wants to be treated fairly and equally, and this kind of satisfied some of those safety needs by creating predictable, consistent environments, but also establishes what we might think about in terms of procedural justice. This also goes in line with some of the research that shows it's really critical for building organizational commitment across the workforce, and it also creates that environment where merit can be recognized, and that kind of supports some of those esteem needs in Maslow's fourth level as well. The fourth major predictor that we found is around managers who invest in employees' growth and development. And this would directly address some of those self-actualization needs in Maslow's fifth level. These are signals that kind of the manager sees long-term potential in the employee, sees that they value that employee, and also creates that reciprocity and loyalty through kind of more demonstrated investment. And as we know, employees today, if they're not feeling like they're getting the opportunities to either advance or meet their career aspirations or continue to be challenged and learn new things, this kind of goes to what we might refer to as the protein career. If I'm not getting it from my current employer, I'm going to have to go somewhere else to get those things that I'm looking for. The fifth major predictor of whether employees rate their managers as being effective leaders is around keeping their commitments. Seems like a no-brainer, right? Well, this kind of establishes reliability, and we know this is also another of those cornerstones of what indicates trust. It also addresses some of those safety needs by creating predictability. It models integrity, which has cascading positive effects also on team culture, which is a major positive. When we take a look at these five behaviors and top predictors of manager effectiveness, we really kind of start to see this create a success profile that we might say is indicative of effective leaders as rated by their direct report teams. We can kind of use this for various frameworks for either learning and development for leaders, managers, but also when it comes down to assessment and selection. What are those things are likely to lead to direct reports rating their managers as effective as we look at these top five behaviors? Moving from manager effectiveness to another critical topic, and one that Chris addressed last month as well too, we continue to find that organizations are really continuing to invest significant effort into engaging their workforce, but also particularly retaining top talent. So as we turn now to intent to stay trends as part of the measurement of engagement, we're finding that employee commitment has remained relatively stable with just a slight increase of 1 point above the same time last year. We would probably agree that there's many factors that impact this sentiment, and we know that the labor market currently probably poses some uncertainty as we continue to move into 2025, as we've seen some wild shifts throughout the US in particular. And this is probably likely to impact employees' intention to stay, and it's probably going to lead to a bit of a holding pattern as they wait and see what might happen. As we dig further into these intent to stay trends, we found some really interesting data, particularly by generational differences. And to dig a bit deeper, Chris shared last month when reviewing engagement trends, there are some interesting generational differences in employee sentiment. And at WSA, we do track those trends by demographics such as age, generation. And so the makeup of our WSA database, while it may not necessarily be an exact mirror of that of what's reported by the US Department of Labor, it gives us a pretty close resemblance in terms of what we might expect to see and the extent to which it represents the broader US workforce. We can see here the generation makeup within our own database. We see that our database currently, and the data that we looked at, is about made up of 6% boomers. Many of those are starting to retire now. Gen X is starting to decrease a little bit as well. Millennials are starting to widen, and we're starting to get introduced to Gen Z, which of course brings a whole slew of new challenges and ways in which managers need to lead those teams, but also be able to cater to their expectations as they enter that workforce as well. As we dig into our research around intent to stay, particularly by generation, some of those most observed differences that we found within engagement were really due to generational attitudes of their intentions to stay. That's what really influenced some of that sentiment we saw in engagement, was more so not due to necessarily satisfaction, advocacy, or pride, but more so due to their intent to stay. For boomers, as an example, their intent to stay, albeit declining, this has remained relatively very high, respectively, compared to the other generations that we'll take a look at in a moment. Gen X, they've experienced probably very little variability since 2021. Not much change at all for this particular generation, interestingly enough, in terms of their commitment and intentions to stay with their employer. And similarly, we'd probably think that millennials also have experienced probably little variability, and they've actually even improved a little bit since the last year. Where we see the biggest change at, interestingly enough, is that of Gen Z. They've experienced the greatest decline from 2022 by 4 percentage points. And when we compare them now to millennials, they are substantially lower, but they have also a staggering 17-point difference compared to their baby boomer colleagues. And this is probably the group of greatest attrition risk right now that HR, managers, leaders should be watching out for, knowing that we are seeing more Gen Z entering the workforce, but they're also more likely to move across to different organizations, particularly if they're not finding things that align with either their values, things that don't necessarily relate to acquiring their career aspirations, not feeling valued, recognized, not getting the communication they want. There's a lot of things that are impacting Gen Z today that managers and leaders should be looking out for. So as we move from generation to where some of those differences actually lie as it relates to intent to stay, we can then take a look at what's actually most influencing and predicting employees' intentions to stay today. So as we take a look at what are the top predictors of the item, I rarely think about looking for a new job elsewhere as part of our engagement index. We find that these retention drivers, they kind of work together as I would say, like an ecosystem. They address different aspects of the employee experience. Organizations that tend to excel across these dimensions, I would say, create both rational as well as emotional reasons for employees to want to stay at their employer, and also make the decision to leave significantly more difficult, even when there might be opportunities external that could arise. As we take a look at some of these top drivers of employees' intent to stay, we see the top predictor believing in the organization's values. When we think about this, it really does kind of create that alignment between one's own personal values, but also that of the organizational identity. And this tends to foster deeper commitment. It also provides meaning beyond just transactional employment and taps into some of that intrinsic motivation that can be critical to building that commitment and going above and beyond in terms of their tasks and responsibilities. The second big predictor is around senior leaders, showing that they value employees. Obviously, a critical component here, and this would say probably demonstrates that contribution is recognized at all levels in the organization, not just by their own immediate or direct supervisors and managers. It also creates that culture of appreciation that cascades throughout the organization, which is really indicative of making sure people feel like they're valued for their work. And then also the next major predictor that we've found is around, are they actually led by what they seem to rate as effective managers? We'd probably go back and say this kind of confirms that critical component of people leave managers, not companies principle, right? It's not always the top predictor, but it is showing up in some of the top predictors of whether employees stay or leave. And this kind of provides that daily reinforcement of organizational culture through their direct supervisor interactions. The fourth predictor of employees' intent to stay today that we're finding is around that belief that their career goals can be met. And I kind of tied that back to that protean career mindset. If I'm not going to be able to meet my career goals or be able to learn new things, I'm probably going to go elsewhere. And we have seen over the past many years that some organizations have decreased their investment in this. And that's where we have also seen some of that uptick in attrition as well, particularly in certain generations. As we take a look at this belief that career goals can be met, this kind of addresses probably that long-term self-actualization needs in terms of Maslow's hierarchy that extend beyond just their current role, right? It removes that primary incentive that they need to look elsewhere for advancement opportunities with another employer. The fifth primary predictor of intent to stay is around the extent to which employees can manage the stress in their jobs. We tend to use this as kind of like a single item proxy for burnout. We know burnout and engagement tend to be on a continuum, each on either side. And this is really kind of indicative to the extent to which we're being able to prevent burnout, which we know a leading cause of voluntary turnover, particularly in certain industries. It also acknowledges that work-life integration as critical to sustainable performance. And as we know, as we've looked through across various work arrangements, those who might be working fully remote or even in a hybrid, many of us here probably are in that type of a work arrangement. Trying to manage both work and personal life can be challenging. You would think you'd have so much more time because you're not commuting, but you tend to pick up things like laundry, having to walk the dogs in the middle of the day. And these things can kind of intrude on that work-life integration. So being able to acknowledge that in leaders, managers trying to help employees and support them on that is critical. And the last major predictor of intent to stay really comes down to equitable and fair pay. And of course, this is really addressing that foundational safety and security need that really must be met before some of those higher order engagement levels come into play, and also demonstrates that the organization values equity and fairness as core principles as well. So as we take a look at this, these really are some of the top predictors today of whether employees stay with their current employer or whether they're looking on the other side of that fence. Is that grass potentially greener on that other side? So definitely some things that any HR business leader can take to look at. How can we potentially move the needle in some of these areas, just knowing today's impact, particularly in the current market, which is ever evolving as we move into 2025, particularly here in the US. As we kind of took a look at our research between what Chris presented last month, as well as some of this research on manager effectiveness, as well as intent to stay, I have a number of takeaways that are worthwhile reviewing that could be useful, but also a lot of practical considerations here. The first one really comes down to what we would maybe refer to as bridging that leadership gap. We see that's probably really important today to make sure that we're implementing regular two-way communication channels between leadership at the top, but also making sure that communication cascades all the way down to the front line, to the employees who are the boots on the ground. We also want to make sure that we're providing vehicles or channels for which employees, even on the front line, can provide their ideas, suggestions, and concerns upwards as well. Another component, though, with that communication is we want to make sure that it's seen as transparent, as we'll get into as it relates to trust coming up too. This also kind of creates some opportunities for senior leaders to really directly interact with and understand frontline employee experiences. In healthcare, it's always critical that we found in our research that leaders, administrators, they do rounds throughout their healthcare facilities, hospitals, talking with the employees, the nurses, technical people to understand what are the things that are most impacting them and their patients as having an indicative impact on their experience. Number two is really around strengthening that strategic alignment. This is clearly and has been for many years one of the top drivers of engagement. And this is important because leaders should be clearly communicating the company's vision and the future direction. Where are we going? How are we going to get there? And most importantly, what does this mean for employees? How are they part of something bigger than themselves? This particularly also helps employees see the direct connection between their own work and the company goals in terms of their tasks, their responsibilities, seeing that they're not just a cog in the wheel, even if you're a janitor. And also regularly reinforces how organizational changes align with some of those strategic objectives. Because as we know, making sure that we're communicating those changes has a big impact on employees' experience, particularly as it comes from their managers and whether they're seen as effective leaders. It also ensures that the company values are not just communicated, but also actively demonstrated and role modeled, particularly when it comes to decision making. The third takeaway is building trust in leadership. And this has also become a critical component and oftentimes goes hand in hand with strategic alignment or future vision, as you might refer to it. And it kind of ensures that consistent demonstration of those company values as well. It maintains that transparency in decision making, but also showing that authentic care for employee well being and success. As we know from research and trust, trust is kind of composed of three components. One, do leaders have the ability to do what they say they're going to do? Do they have integrity? Will they keep their commitments? And those are some of the critical things most important there. But also, a third component that also needs to be recognized is benevolence. Do leaders and managers have employees' best interests in mind? Number four is around enhancing career development. We saw that as a consistent driver of engagement, of employees' intent to stay, the extent to which managers are investing in employees' growth and development opportunities. And this really kind of highlights that there's a need to develop some clear career pathways and growth opportunities within the organization. So that way, employees at one particular area know, how can I progress upwards? But for some employees, it's just as important to progress laterally. So they need to know what are those competencies and proficiencies they need to close the gap on in order to upskill to move around in the organization and not just have a job, but create a career. It also provides some of that targeted development programs that align with both those individual and those organizational goals, but it also regularly or is also important that managers are having those regular and consistent career discussions with their teams around their team's career aspirations. That way, managers, leaders can help identify those tools, resources, opportunities for employees to continue to be challenged, continue to learn new things, either within their own particular line of work or potentially even cross-functionally, but also see what other opportunities beyond their own role are available throughout the organization as well. Number five is around strengthening manager effectiveness. We've seen this as one of the most critical predictors of engagement today. And when we think about this, it's really around providing targeted training for managing in different work arrangements, particularly in different scenarios as the organizations change and adapt given differing markets, but also this focus on developing managers' abilities to provide those growth opportunities and support their teams as their teams look to grow, develop, move throughout the organization. It's also important to ensure that managers are equipped to effectively communicate those organizational changes. Oftentimes, that's where organizations get hung up. Leaders at the top have a good idea of what needs to change, but they're not always giving managers, particularly down the front line, the talking points or resources to be able to communicate those changes, the decisions behind them, but also how those relate to the organization's strategy or values, which is another critical component for managers to be seen as effective as by rated for them their direct report teams. Number six takeaway is around focusing on well-being and work-life balance. This comes down to implementing policies that support manageable stress levels, but also create some of those clear boundaries between work and personal time, particularly in various work arrangements. Number seven, ensuring fair compensation. This has become a larger predictor of engagement than we've seen in the past. And sometimes this comes down to not just around a paycheck number, but clearly communicating about compensation philosophy and practices. but also some of that transparent career progression and associated compensation changes as it relates to how people might move around throughout the organization and at different levels. Number 8 is around optimizing work arrangements. We're going to talk more about this here shortly, but considering hybrid or remote work options where operationally feasible has been seen for many organizations to be a huge competitive advantage. We've seen a number of organizations, some of the biggest brands in their industries, having a call for return to office. We've seen that there's been greater attrition at those organizations that people have tried to maintain either their hybrid or fully remote work arrangements. Some have quit and looked at going to other organizations where they may have that opportunity. So these tend to be talent attractors for those organizations that have those opportunities where they are operationally feasible, of course. And also developing specific management practices for those different work arrangements. It does take a different level of skill and competency for managers, leaders, to being able to manage those diverse and dispersed workforces as well. Number 9 is around addressing generational differences. This comes down to developing retention strategies, specifically targeted at younger generations today, seeing that they probably have the greatest propensity for turnover, and then creating programs that address Gen Z's unique career development needs and also their workplace expectations today. Lastly, monitor and adapt. We're always huge advocates that while an annual census survey is still the gold standard, regular pulse checks on engagement levels across different employee segments is just a good way to keep an understanding of how we're progressing on where we intended to take action, but also identify, do we need to pivot? And also helps us track the effectiveness of our engagement initiatives. Also is another opportunity just to keep that two-way communication system open by gathering that feedback on management effectiveness and other critical topics as it relates to the employee experience. And lastly, adjusting those strategies based on changing workforce needs and preferences. So some good practical takeaways from our current research. And I do want to highlight a bonus learning session that's going to happen next month that was unplanned for, but we had so much great research as part of the State of the Workforce 2025 research that we wanted to devote an entire learning session to remote, hybrid, and on-site work arrangements and the research we were finding there. So on May 21st at 1 Central, my excellent colleague Cameron Klein is going to be leading that session to walk through our research, the practical implications and considerations for those organizations who have those work arrangements. So thank you for taking the time to join us today and hope this was valuable.
James, great data and great information. We do have really quickly, because I know we're at the bottom of the hour, but there was a question that was asked, which is with the intent to stay predictors, do you see any differences by generation, and specifically comparing Gen Z to Gen X?
Yeah, there likely are some differences in those predictors. We haven't run all of those yet by the various generations, but something we can definitely look at because we do know Gen Z, as an example, wants different things. They're at a different career stage of their life right now. So there are different things that are most important to them compared to baby boomers who are starting to exit the workforce. So we have more to follow up on. We don't have those exact predictors or what's most important to each or how they maybe respond to those different topics, but something we can definitely look into.
Great. Well, again, thank you, James. And I hope everyone does look forward to Cameron's next learning session. As James said, there was so much that we uncovered in our refresh database that we couldn't do it all justice in just 2 parts. So as a reminder, the recording will be available in 48 hours. And please do go out and register for Cameron's session on May 21st. Have a great day.